Hello, everybody. Happy Friday to you. First and foremost, I am so sorry we're not meeting face to face today. However, fear not because you will have this lecture to follow. And actually, this is better than a face to face lecture because you get to play this over and over to your heart's content until you learn this material. So, with that being said, what I wanted to do is make sure I went over Chapter 2 scientific methods a little bit more closely um, so that you have a good basis in terms of when we're talking about scientific methods in psychology, what I'm saying and what it means. Pretty much when we're looking at empirical data, when we're talking about research, these are the areas that we do a lot of work in this field. So, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We'll first start talking about evaluating evidence and how we start to think critically. Okay, first and foremost, let's get the operational terms down. And when I talk about science, think about science in terms of you having the ability to be able to gain, to be able to test, as well as evaluate knowledge in its essence. When we discuss research, we do that through careful observations, and there's a series of steps that we would take. The first one would be hypothesis. And in hypothesis, some people think of it as an educated guess. No, I want you to think of it as that starting question that we then have to explain whether something happens or not. But it all comes from a question. So you have your hypothesis. We talk about, is the sky blue? That was in my other course. Someone came up with that question, and well, we decided we were going to run with it. So, in order for us to be able to answer the hypothesis, first thing we have to do is decide on what method we would use. And when we're talking about methods, we're talking about how to formulate and come up with a plan of action, so to speak, so that we can gather the data that's necessary in order for us to get the answers we are seeking and looking for. The next thing would be results, and that's pretty much if you did a survey, for example, asking people questions, or if you had people, your participants run through a series of different tests, then you would want to gather the results from that. And that's when we would lead into the fourth area, which is interpretation. Now deciding if the information we gathered is actually going to be able to provide us with that knowledge and the answers that we're looking for within our hypothesis. So this is that time when we're starting to evaluate the knowledge that we're seeking, right? So the fifth thing, and this is important, replicability, replication. I'll say it that way because it's easier for me to say it that way without sounding like a lips. But anyway, when we try to replicate uh, an experiment, it helps us in knowing whether or not that information is going to actually be reliable and valid. That's the basis of it. And of course, I'm giving you the rundown, dirty version of a quick way of answering that question, but I'm going to go into it more. But that's what we do when we're trying to replicate a particular design. And I'll talk about that more further. So just to give you a visualization of what I just mentioned, you start with the hypothesis. Again, the hypothesis is a statement or question, a thought process that we work toward gaining an answer to. We want to explain it. We do that by methods, which in this case, we're going to try to test the hypothesis against a particular method that we design that would help. Hopefully, it'll provide you with the answers necessary. Sometimes it's going to also give you what you don't want, but that's all about scientific journeys, okay? There's two different routes you might go. our results can support that hypothesis, or like I just mentioned, the results might oppose what our hypothesis originally was. One of the things we would look for when we're seeing a support of the hypothesis is that the confidence of what we were discussing is enhanced through the results, and our interpretation comes into play based on that. Same holds true about the confidence being diminished when it opposes our hypothesis. Here we might see that the hypothesis actually changed. For example, I just said how in one of my classes we used the sky is blue. However, right now I'm looking out of my window and I can tell you I see a gray sky. So now you have to consider and wonder what uh, what's the opposition? What created the changes? What modified and diminished the blue skies? And again, I'm not going to go into deep on this slide, but we'll get there. Just bear with me. So, replication is pretty much when we take the data that we've gathered from doing our testing, um, and pretty much we do it over again, so to speak, to see if we're going to come up with the same results that we did the first time. A good example that I share with everybody would be Kenneth and Mamie Clark's work that they've done in terms of, if you haven't heard of it, look it up and read more about it. It's Brown versus Education, where they wind up doing their experiment on with dolls in terms of having black children give their thoughts and feelings in regards to a white doll in comparison to a black doll. Needless to say, that study demonstrated black children seeing themselves lower in in self-esteem, and they didn't think of themselves in a positive light in comparison to looking at the white dolls. They would say white dolls are good, black dolls are not, and so forth. Well, this study has been replicated over and over and over within the last 50 years. The sad truth is their results have been similar throughout. I'll never forget, there was a documentary special done where this high school student, she was doing her AP Psych and she was doing a research project, and she decided to replicate Mamie and Kenneth Clark's study. And she came up with the exact results, which this was done now, well, I'll say maybe 8 years ago. In that time, that was a scary scenario to see that the results were still that much the same. So when we're looking at replicable results, we're wanting to know if we do this test over again, how similar those results will be. Now, let's talk about meta-analysis. Here, this is when I'm taking several different results and I'm going to combine those results from several different studies to gain one giant study. And what that will do is help me to determine whether or not I can see any kind of variations within the procedures of those tests by combining them all together. It's confusing, but make sure you read about it. Make sure you put in your questions on so that I can explain it more to you. Just know that more, is building up by taking several different studies and putting them together so that we can see the results of all these studies and create more or less one new large study, and taking the results from each of them and pretty much doing a compare and contrast, if that can help you to kind of understand. You've been following along, and if you've also, hopefully you've already started doing your reading, so you're catching up and you kind of understand it. But here's a knowledge check. At which point in the research process, do researchers consider results that match the prediction might be caused by another factor? Would that be the methodology? Would that be through interpretation? Is that going to be when we replicate it, or burden of proof? What do you think? Okay, well, the response and answer I hope y'all came up with is during interpretation. Remember, the results may contradict the hypothesis, so we as the researchers, we would then abandon or we might have to make a change to the original hypothesis. Therefore, our results would match that prediction by having investigated to see whether or not we have enough confidence in that hypothesis originally or through modification. And thus, should we consider another type of hypothesis that actually would fit the results that was provided? So in more terms that I want you to be familiar with, let's talk about theory. When we say theory, more or less, you know how we've done some experiments, we've done research. Well, hopefully when we received answers to our hypothesis, it allowed us to take it further and create a theory with it, which would help in terms of explaining how the model would fit because of all the observation and testing we did, and how it made us be able to come up with a good prediction based off the material and data that we collected. And because we were able to gather that and we saw that it was accurate and it's valid and reliable, hence we now can discuss this in terms of a theory. A theory being that I'm now explaining what that hypothesis was all about and how it can be utilized and worked through and replicated in the whole 9 yards. Now it's a theory. You want to know the term falsifiable. Falsifiable is taking theories and looking at it in a clear, precise term in which we would then say whether or not evidence would count against it. Hence, we would try to imagine what that would be in terms of contradicting a theory. If we say the sky is blue and ultimately I can contradict that and say, no, the sky is gray, then we know that it may be falsifiable. But it's not that the theory is false, it's just that it's not bulletproof. And then we have to take the burden of proof, which is an obligation for us to have to take time to show the evidence to support my claim that no, the sky is blue. Right. Now, parsimony. This is a term in which when we talk about choices of how we take our explanations, a lot of times we try to take the facts and fit it into our schema, so to speak. And often we'll see ourselves wanting to take few and simple assumptions, which would be more consistent, as well as taking well-established theories or knowledge and just working with that. Sometimes we hate change, so to speak, and we don't want to consider alternatives. When we talk about degrees of open-mindedness, this is talking about you being willing to consider evidence showing what might not be what you think should be, but it is, if that makes sense to you. That's what we call parsimony. So just remember, parsimony is referring to the principle that all else being equal, then that means the simplest explanation or solution really would usually be the best one to use. Think of it, and you probably have heard of Occam's razor, in which it suggests that those are necessary complications or assumptions. really should be avoided when we're trying to explain a particular phenomenon. There's going to be different fields where parsimony might be applied, and that can be in terms of when we're talking about science, where we're comparing the different hypotheses. We're looking into one with fewer assumptions and toward more that's straightforward, and that would be more preferable. Then you have the assuming one that explain the data equally well. However, parsimony in philosophy can help in terms of reasoning by eliminating overly complex arguments that lack any kind of evidence or might be redundant in terms of the process to explaining it. In regards to mathematics and statistics, we're looking more in terms of how that model selection, or even within those few parameters, going to be often preferred unless there's more complex models that would significantly improve the accuracy of the data. There's also everyday life, though. And in that terms, parsimony can actually apply to how you make your decisions when you problem solve. You're going to try to always go simple, more direct approaches, which generally is going to be more effective. And it's that principle that will help you to maintain clarity, efficiency, as well as avoiding any kind of overcomplicated actions. Now, let's talk about extrasensory perception. Where I'm talking about is that ability to gain information through these special means that's going to be beyond the traditional five senses, that being sight, sound, touch, taste, or smell. Think of it as intuition. It's often associated a lot of times with the paranormal phenomenon, and it's really not scientifically verified. However, ESP encompasses several different type of abilities. You'll have individuals who say they can do telepathy, that ability to transfer thoughts or feelings between people without using any kind of physical interaction. Then you have individuals who might be labeled or classified as clairvoyant. Here we're talking about the ability to perceive events or objects beyond the normal sensory contact, which often involves distant or unseen type of events. Then you had the precog. I don't know if you saw that Tom Cruise movie. I can't remember the name, but precognition was where they helped them to come up with those murder mysteries. It's foreseeing the future without any basis in terms of the present information or having any kind of inference, but it's just there. Then there's telekinesis or psychokinesis, in which a person may have the ability to move or manipulate objects with the mind and not touch it at all. Another thought for you to think about would be retrocognition. And here I'm talking about that ability to be able to perceive past events beyond normal recollection, or documented history. All right. A lot of information about ESP or extrasensory perception, right? Remember, it's associated though with a psychic phenomenon, and while it is popular in terms of folklore or media, certain belief systems, it really lacks empirical data or empirical evidence, and it's still a very controversial scientific field. Studies on ESP have not really been able to produce any consistent or replicable results, and therefore it leads to more skepticism than actuality or fact. Now, when we talk about anecdotes in terms of looking at it in research, we're really talking about personal stories, our individual experiences, or isolated examples. You know how I try to relate things with all my stories? That's an anecdote. And it's to be able to illustrate a situation. Now, while I might give you an anecdote and it's compelling and it's relatable to the subject, it's not considered strong evidence in terms of scientific research. And that's because it lacks rigor or control or really objectivity of the systematic studies of that particular area. So, Here's the real reason why anecdotes really are not reliable in research. First, it lacks the ability to generalize. It's going to be based on single or few occurrences. So it really may not represent broader patterns or trends. What happens though is one person might deal with the situation while the others don't. Of course, there's going to possibly be bias. And because of that, people will really share their anecdotes selectively. It's like I'm purposely telling you particular stories in order for you to gain knowledge about the area that I'm trying to teach you. And I'm going to be dramatic, I'm going to be explosive, and these examples I'm probably skewing a little bit in terms of perception of reality to kind of drive the point home. The third thing you got to realize though is that there's no control with anecdotes because it really don't account for any kind of other variables that might influence an outcome. In contrast, scientific research is actually going to control the variables that would establish causation. Fourth thing I want you to know about anecdotes. You can't replicate it. Scientific evidence relies on replication. Multiple studies showing the same result. Keep that in mind. And anecdotes by nature, really, they're isolated and you can't replicate that. You can't replicate my story. You might see it or hear about it, but it's not going to be the exact same thing. So while anecdotes may serve as a starting point for a hypothesis, the generation of the foundation, it can be used to illustrate a point. It's not going to be sufficient in terms of evidence or empirical data for drawing conclusions on that hypothesis or research. As a scientist, we would then want to rely on empirical data, and it's going to be through those controlled, systematic observations and experimentations that we would want results from so that we may interpret it. All right, so let me tell you now about psychics. Professional psychics are those individuals who would claim that they have that supernatural ability, that they are able to perceive, or they have that energy that goes beyond our human senses. More than not, they would offer services, probably for a fee, that typically involves providing insight or guidance on personal matters like your relationships, whether you're going to make money this year, how's your health or future events. You might even have people claim to possess that extrasensory perception as well, the ESP, in terms of the paranormal abilities. And again, you'll have those who's clairvoyant. You'll have those who would say they can see the future. Some who might say they can incorporate, the psychics would say they can incorporate telepathy. They can talk to those who transcended from this world. So it can grow really into a lot of different areas for them. There's a third thing though that they might talk about, in which they might say that mediumship, and I already just gave a hint about the deceased. Again, is communicating with spirits or offering messages or guidance from beyond. You got to be careful though. Sometimes people are just out there to try to make that money. Now, another area that I want you to understand is about astrology. And it is actually a controversy here. But astrology is looking into the positions of the stars and planets to try to predict or interpret events in a person's life. Now, let me just say something really quick about that. I'm going to give you an anecdote to talk about how we might take that information as far as astrology. Now, is it scientific enough or psychological? No. But when I worked at Mississippi State Hospital, one of the things we observed is that our patients would become more anxious, more agitated, more restless when there was a full moon. And we couldn't explain it, but we knew that at the start of the full moon, we were going to have a lot more activity. Now, that's in itself to say the hypothesis there we could say is that during the full moon, people's behaviors would change and become erratic, um, or they can become, disoriented or what have you. So, with that being said, we never did research on the area, and probably because we don't really feel we can gather enough scientific evidence to be able to respond and answer the hypothesis. But we have observed and noticed it. All right, I'm going to go back on and move forward. Have you ever had your palms read or had a tarot reading? Well, you may have some psychics that use tarot cards to be able to gain insight for a person's situation or choices or their future by interpreting symbols and patterns. But here's the kicker. A lot of times you got to be careful on how they're saying it because they're going to try to get you to respond to different things where you're actually answering the question for them right before they give you the answer. So you need to make sure you're careful with that. So a common setting for psychics is they do private consultations. You might find them in fairs. You might see them on Netflix, which would be the media. So there's all different kind of ways. All right. So let me just give some criticisms here. Well, a lot of people do find comfort or they enjoy, because I love watching the paranormal. I have that on all the time and thinking about the spirits and everything and how they go about trying to learn about spirits that's transcended. But it's that entertainment, and then within that profession, that it faces significant skepticism in terms of from the scientific community. So it's a big critique that it lacks evidence. That, like I said, you might have cold reading techniques where some psychics are going to use some of the psychological techniques, like cold reading or getting into it and answer general or vague questions that'll help them to answer statements or make statements that you think is just coming out of the blue when you actually provided them with that information ahead of time. You might have confirmation bias in terms of where a person will remember hit get that information, or they might say, oh well, it didn't come to me that way when they miss. Despite all that, professional psychics, they are popular and they make their money, um, and people do seek out their services. So I'm not knocking them, but I'm just saying they lack the scientific methods that we're talking about. All right, so now let me just go ahead and talk about a little bit quickly about some of the principles that revolve around experiments, in terms of which we use methods that are sound, objective, as well as capable of being able to produce valid and reliable results. That's what the experiment would do. Some of the tenets of an experimental design I'm going to just briefly talk about. I'm not going to go into depth, but we would have controlled variables in which all the variables except the independent variable would be held constant. Then you might have manipulations of the independent variable in which the independent variable we deliberately would change or try to manipulate. Okay, that's the main thing I want you to remember. Independent variable, we manipulate that when we're doing an experiment in order to test the effect on what we would have as a dependent variable. That manipulation is going to be the core part of the experiment that will allow us to test for causality or causal relationships. So an example I can give you would be, think about when they have new medications. So in that drug trial, the independent variable might be the medication that's going to be administered to the participants. Okay. Or we might turn around and say, okay, we're going to give some placebo. We'll talk more about it. Then, of course, I talked about the dependent variable, in which we're looking more about the outcome or response in terms of how we would measure to be able to assess the effect that the independent variable would have on that dependent variable. So more or less, it'll provide you with information that would help you to evaluate whether when we manipulated a cause, it created a change. An example of that would be measuring test scores to be able to assess whether or not there was an impact in my teaching methods, for example, which would be that independent variable because I can change how I teach, on how you learn. And how you learn is the dependent variable. Can I change, can I impact that through my teaching methods? All right, briefly, let me talk about random assignments. That's when we take participants randomly and put them throughout different experimental groups to kind of make sure that the group is similar at the start of the experiment, but where we reduce the bias by not hand picking them. So it's going to make more effects of the outcome come out more because we manipulated the independent variable, but we didn't necessarily touch the participants. All right, so one way of seeing that would be to look at how we would do the drug trial. And in that trial, patients might be randomly assigned to either a treatment group, which would be the treatment group would be the ones who would receive the drug itself, right? Or they might be put into what we call a control group. Now, you heard me say the term placebo before. The control group is the group that would get the placebo, okay? And we tend to have control groups more or less to help us to create a baseline so we have something to compare information to. And it's really not going to be exposed to the independent variables, so to speak, but it's going to be exposed more to a standard condition like if we gauge placebo. This allows us to investigate and compare results with an experimental group, and it'll allow us to be able to draw conclusions on how the effects of the independent variable would be toward that dependent variable. So to kind of help you understand that scenario, think about a psychological study like stress. We all get stressed, right? And we try to have different stress reduction interventions where a group might receive one technique while the control group won't get any interventions. That would allow us to create that baseline. Now, of course, within an experiment, you need to be able to replicate. Remember? Again, that's when we're taking experiments and we're redoing it to see if we can come up with, using the same procedures, if we're going to come up with the same results. It'll allow us to verify our findings and whether or not to see if it's going to be consistent and that it's not due to chance or any kind of conditions that was within that original experiment. So another, I gave y'all Kenneth and Mamie for an example, but another one is, let's talk about vitamins, a vitamin supplement, and how it might be able to be reproduced in labs with different populations to kind of check to see if the results are reliable for the people when they're taking these vitamins. That would be a replicable trial. Again, randomization though allows us to make sure when there's variations among participants or test subjects that it's going to be evenly distributed amongst those experimental groups. And again, it helps to reduce bias because the likelihood of those differences and those outcomes is going to be due more to our manipulation and less to the fact that we handpicked the people that was in it. Blinding is a term I would say is used to kind of help reduce bias, more or less that allows us to make sure participants and the researchers, neither one of us knows what's going on. When we have what we call a single blind, that's where the experiment, that's where the participants would be unaware of the group assignment, but the investigators would know where the participants went. But a double blind, both the participants and researchers are clueless. Thus it reduced the risk of any kind of expectation effects. So let's go back to the drug trial for an example, where in usually what happens is neither the patient nor the doctor will know if the patient is receiving the real drug or they're in the control group and getting a placebo. Finally, I'm going to just say briefly, when we're talking about experiments, of course, it's based on hypothesis testing, where we're designing the experiment to kind of look at a specific hypothesis. It allows us to see whether or not we can predict the relationship between those independent and dependent variables. So experiments more or less are considered to be structured. You're going to see how it'll help either support or refute your hypothesis once you collect your data. And I know I've given you a whole lot of information there, but I wanted you to know what experiments are, and we're going to stop there at this point. There'll be more, but I wanted to give you a good synopsis about what an experiment is. So it's time to talk about the research principles, general research principles. There's several types of research that can be conducted, and there's different meanings that you should know about and understand. So when I'm talking about basic research, I'm talking about more or less what you might be doing in class this semester when you go to write your papers. It's going to be more theoretical, and you might be gathering data through looking at different literature, pulling up that information and reading about something and being able to provide and do comparisons in that nature. When we're talking about operational definitions, of course, we're looking at the procedural component to research, ways that we might be able to produce, work toward measuring, and also being able to provide a numerical value to the work that we're doing. Now, I gave you this whole list of information about experiments, right? Well, understand experiments fall under the umbrella of applied research. Think of it as solving problems, those practical problems. And more or less, things that we would face, particularly in psychology, is how we would sample. And when we're talking about sampling, I'm talking about groups of people or participants that we would be studying their behaviors in one way or another. When we talk about behavior of participants, know that we're looking at it differently because of the way we may observe it. It can be through natural observation, or we can have it within a more structured environment. So, hence, there's different ways and different types of research that we would want to utilize in our work. All right, so let's talk about a convenience sample. This is where there's a non-probability, it's that kind of technique where participants are selected really because of their availability, their proximity, or the ease of access for us as a researcher, instead of us using random selection. And it's going to really be used more times when we have budget issues or logistical constraints that may prevent us from using a more rigorous sampling method. Main things I want you to know about convenience sampling would be first is ease of access, of course. Again, participants really are chosen more or less because they're readily available to you. And it can be like if you're doing a research project, you might use your classmates, you might use your colleagues. It could be family, it could be somebody that lives next door in a specific location. Realize that this is non-random selection, and unlike random sampling, where every individual in that population has an equal chance of being selected, with convenience sampling, it really doesn't follow that systematic approach. And because of that, it can introduce bias into your experiment. It is, though, low cost and quick. Convenience sampling really is a cheaper and faster way, and it's easy to implement, really, because it's not requiring any complex procedures or extensive resources for you to gather participants. You can just pass around the sheet to people in your classroom and have them answering the questions, and boom, there it is. So, an example to give you, it would be, let's say, for example, I'm conducting a study that might need to learn about students as the participants. I have all of you do it because you're in front of me. It's easy to recruit you, and y'all are accessible. Some advantages for a convenience sample, again, when we talk about efficiency, it's really quick and inexpensive way to be able to gather and collect data, particularly when we're talking about exploratory type research or those pilot studies. The feasibility, though, is it's often going to be only viable when the researcher is limited in time or in money. Disadvantages, again, bias is a big one. Convenience samples are really going to be prone to selection bias because they might not represent the broader population, but you're going to say that it does, which limits your research. This really can limit the generalizability of your findings. Another issue would be lack of representativeness. The sample really is going to be overrepresented in certain groups. People who live near the researcher or share similar characteristics, it's going to skew your results. How or when would you want to use convenience sampling? That's something we should know, right? More times than not, it's going to be used again in exploratory research. And when I say exploratory research, this is when the goal would be to try to gain some initial or preliminary insights rather than you making any kind of generalizing type of claims. Usually it's going to be done in the early stages of research so you can try to take a method that you created and design and test that method or the instruments before actually branching out into a more larger or even a representative study. So there'll be situations in which limited resources might occur in which random sampling won't be feasible because of the constraint of the time or the budget or even not having access to the population that would really help in terms of providing you with proper results. When we say that convenience sampling can be useful in certain situations, yeah, but you have to really be careful because when you're taking time to interpret those results, understand that lack of randomization is actually bringing in the bias and it's going to put limits on your external validity in your study. So, now let me tell you about representative sampling. This is a subset of a population that would accurately reflect the characteristics or the demographics as well as the variations of a larger population. So your goal more or less would be in having a representative sample would to help make sure that the findings from the sample would actually be able to be generalized toward an entire population in terms of high level of confidence. Another way for me to say that would be a representative sample would actually mirror the population from which it's going to draw its terms in terms of important traits or the variables that's going to be thought of. It's like age or gender or income or your education. You get an understanding. Major characteristics for this particular sampling would be proportionality, where we're looking at the proportions of key characteristics in terms of that sample. Again, that could be, for example, age, gender, race, your social economic status. All these would be closely matched within that population. Here, when we're talking about random selection, you want it to be able to achieve that representativeness. And the random sampling would actually be used where each member of the population, again, would have an equal opportunity or chance to be selected for the study. That'll reduce the selection bias, and it's going to help increase the likelihood that your sample would be more accurate and reflect the population that you are want to be represented. So again, generalizability. The big advantage here for a representative sample would be that those results that you gather actually can be more confidently generalized to the larger population, assuming that the sample really reflected your population. So an example that I can share with you on that level would be, think of it as you're doing a research project and you're studying public opinions on climate change. And within that, 51% of the population is female, while 49% is male. Your representative sample would be similar to gender distribution. So if you had 25% of the population between the ages of 18 and 30, then roughly 25% of the sample should be that age group. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, what are some of the advantages for representative sample? Accurate generalization. When we have those findings of a representative sample, it allows us to be more confident that it's applied to a broader population, allowing it to have more of a higher valuable effect for the research that would aim to predict or to describe the population-wide trends of the particular behavior being studied. It will help to reduce bias because well-selected represented samples actually lowers the bias. And it makes sure that all segments of the population we're testing have a voice and there's no group that's being over or underrepresented. Now, of course, if I talked about advantages, you have disadvantages. Cost and complexity. When you're trying to get a true representative sample, this is going to take more time, more effort, a lot more resources. It might involve trying to define the population and then using random sampling methods. Then you got to take a look at data collection challenges in which certain populations, it might be hard for you to reach, or in which you can make it, kind of difficult to be able to include them in a sample because it might threaten the representation. Now, ways you might be able to achieve a representative sample can be simple random sampling. It can be stratified sampling in which the population is divided into subgroups, which is the strata. And then those random samples are drawn from each stratum within that proportion of that occurrence of that population. So there's several different ways, and you have also systematic sampling that might help in terms of nth member when we're talking about populations from randomly ordered lists. So with that being said, I will be ending this video lecture because I'm at the 50-minute mark and it's a whole discussion. However, remember, be sure to finish reading chapter 2 because this wasn't all of it. Make sure you read it. Next week is exam week and practice quiz. Monday is going to be in class, if I remember correctly. And if I'm wrong, please send me a message where you're meeting. As far as I recall, it's going to be practice quizzes in class on Monday. And that will be with Miss Samuels. Lana Samuels will be doing that with you on Monday. On Wednesday, that was going to be Canvas Day online, where you'll do the second practice. And then your big exam, those 100 questions, will be on Friday. And again, that's going to be on Canvas. However, if you have any questions, concerns, want to say hi, feel free to bring that to class or send it to me in a message in the inbox. I thank you so much for listening. Enjoy your weekend, and I will see you when. Take care.